As you know, there'll be at least one trans woman in the Olympics this summer, being someone who's a weightlifter. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the whole transgender issue in women's sports is really complicated, and the general public does not generally hasn't been educated as to what all the pieces are. So maybe I should start with the first piece, which is that when Title IX passed in the mid 1970s, it was an anti-discrimination law. You can't discriminate on the basis of sex, with one exception. In this biological space called sport, and only within competitive sport, not intramurals, not recreation, not for fun kinds of things, but in competitive sport, separate sex sport was allowed, and a space was created, and that space was created to protect biological females, because at the onset of puberty, males undergo a tremendous surge in testosterone. As a result, and this hormone is very powerful, it is actually a prohibited substance in sport. You can't take testosterone, it's like steroids, right? But it makes men have longer and more dense bones, more muscle tissue, more hemoglobin, which is the oxygen carrying part of the blood. And these are things that really matter in sport. And it gives males post-puberty 8 to 20% sports performance advantages. And Congress understood that if boys and girls had to try out for one team, and it was a co-ed team, that very few girls would get a chance to be selected, because boys would always be bigger and stronger, and sport is all about propelling an object through space or overcoming the resistance of a mass. It is all about strength, speed, reaction time. So this space was created, girls and women's sport. That being said, trans girls, anyone who's born female, and born male, and wants to identify as female should be welcome in women's sports. And I'm a member of a group called the Women's Sports Policy Working Group that has created a model so that trans girls could fairly participate in girls and women's sports. So that being said, people have to first understand that all trans girls are not the same. Most folks don't know that trans girls and women make different decisions about whether or not they even want to go through puberty. And if they do go through puberty, they make decisions whether or not they want to change their bodies, either by taking female affirming hormones like estrogen, or to change themselves surgically to remove the male testes, for instance. So there are three real categories of trans girls that need to be accommodated in women's sports if we want them to play in this protected space without disadvantaging biological females. So the first category is the trans girl who does not experience male puberty. She has no T advantage. And just so you understand how this happens, it's usually a young person who identifies very early, before puberty, that her gender identity does not match her birth sex. And together with her family and her doctors, they decide that let's wait until she's an adult, and they put her on puberty blockers. So it stalls the onset of puberty until she's old enough to make an adult decision. And at that point, she may say, I I haven't gone through male puberty. I want to go on gender affirming hormones. And so she never experiences puberty. She never gets any of the male sex-linked advantages. She never gets that spurt of testosterone. She should play in women's sports head to head with all biological females. And for all intent and purposes, that is fair competition. The second category of trans girls is the girl starts puberty and makes the decision to mitigate, to lessen her advantage. And she does this in either of two ways, by taking hormones or by surgically changing her body. And what this does is get testosterone down into the female range. And the female range is very low. It's like less than 2 nanomoles. Don't even worry about what nanomoles are, but it's a little bit of testosterone. Where males are in the 7 to 25 nanomole range, and there's no overlap. So this is a significant mitigation of advantage. That being said, right, if that person meets the international standard to be eligible for the female category, which is set in nanomoles. This is set by the International Sport Federation or the Olympic Committee as the entry eligibility factor to Olympics women's sports, for instance. Then she can play just like the girl who never goes through puberty. She can compete equally with males, with females, biological females. The last category is the problematic category. And it's okay. There are some trans girls who don't want to change their bodies. They're afraid of hormones. They don't want to go on hormones. They just identify as female and want to be accepted in this construct of women's sports. And we propose that the way to do that is to have that girl be a part of the team. Think about sports, competitive sports. 90% of it is a social construct. You're practicing together, you have team meetings together, you're traveling together. A minuscule portion of what you do is competition, right? It's once a week for maybe an hour or two, right? Or twice a week, depending on your sport. So we propose that that girl be allowed to participate in women's sports, but be separately scored. What does that mean? What does that, look like? What it would look like is, for instance, everybody's familiar with the US Open in golf. There is a professional sports category scoring pattern, and you could be an amateur. And there are 2 trophies at the end, right? They play on the same course, they play the same game, they're part of the same competition. At the end, there are 2 winners, right? One for pros, one for amateurs. So picture women's sports, let's say the high jump event, right? So at the high jump, everybody looks the same. Everybody kind of is waiting to get the bar and to get the bar changed and to take their turn at a jump. You go until the very last jump. At the end of the competition, you have 2 scores.
Right.
You have one for open. You have one for the protected biological category. This is not the only thing women's sports needs to accommodate. What about the trans boy who does not want to go through hormone therapy or surgery? The trans boy, born female, not wanting to take hormones, has a biological female body. That trans boy should also be allowed to participate in girls and women's sports if they want to, right? That's a biological female. This is protected space in sport for a biological female body. And then you've all heard, I think, of non-binary individuals, right? They don't want to identify as males or females, right? You would treat them depending on their status after puberty, right? Did you go through puberty? You didn't go through puberty. Did you successfully mitigate? Did you not want to mitigate, right? And so this is the complexity of the transgender issue in sport, and we have to deal with it sensitively, but sensibly, and still have to protect the biological, female.
Can you sort of sum that up, what that means?
So right now, the issue is at its extremes. There are states that are saying there's a state law that you have to participate in girls' sports according to your birth sex, and they exclude transgender girls completely, no matter what their status is, right? And you can see where that discriminates against trans girls who don't have a male sex-linked advantage. And then there's a position of trans organizations that say, we want trans girls to be treated identically. No two trophies. You have to treat them identically all the time. And that throws out the protection of the biological female category. And what we're saying is we've got to play in the middle. We've got to listen to science, and we have to protect biological females. We have to understand the position of the transgender girl to see whether she has advantage or not.
Has there been research, at least, to show that if a transgender woman went through puberty as a boy, that even if you work with hormones, there's still been a greater buildup of bone and muscle mass?
Yes, and this comes in the middle. The answer to the question, did you successfully mitigate? And what we know is that this is what you're describing is called legacy advantage. That no matter what hormones you take, you can't get rid of the muscle mass that you developed when you went through puberty. And it's still an advantage, which is why we're saying that we have to go according to the standards that are set by the International Sport Federation, by sport and by event. We know that muscle mass, the advantages will be greater in contact sports, in strength-based sports, weightlifting, power sports, the sprinting events, and they will be less in the distance events. And that is where research really has not caught up yet, in the sense that what should the standard be by event and by sport? Does that make sense? I mean, we know we have to protect the biological female, but what is successful mitigation? That's where the research is being done right now. The latest research on large numbers of military transgender individuals tell us that we probably have to have transgender girls, for instance, stay on hormones for a longer period of time than was originally thought. Like the NCA rule is you have to get your hormone level down continuously for 12 months. That military research is saying it's probably more like 2 years. So there's still this flux. And the point is, can we do the best job we can to protect biological females and to make sure that all transgender women are welcome in women's sports?
When you first started sort of looking at this and looking at the different categories, was there backlash? Was it called transphobic at all?
Well, there's no question that anyone who takes a position against identical treatment is called transphobic. It's a very toxic environment right now. And it's so toxic with both parties at the extremes that unfortunately people aren't listening to each other, and they're not coming to this common ground. Legally, what I've been talking about in terms of how to accommodate that one type of transgender individual who still has the advantage is called an accommodation. So we're talking about designing a girl sport structure that accommodates one type of transgender girl who has an immutable advantage.
And that would be to have a second category for a win.
That's right, to have an open category. So everybody would compete, but that trans girl could only win the open category. That only a biological female could win the biological female category. And I don't want to mislead you. This is not about winning. This is about every girl feeling they have a fair chance to test their competencies. I grew up an athlete, and I beat all the boys on my street up until I was about 12 years old. And that was it then, right? And I went on to be successful in sport only because there was separate sport. So how do we make sure that a girl has that first success experience? And it's not winning. It may be getting a hit. It may be winning a preliminary race. It may be testing herself and seeing her potential. I can be as good as that person. But if we have transgender girls with advantage who a girl looks at and says, there's no way that I can compete, on the same track or the same whatever. That's when girls decide to drop out of sport. So it's about making sure that there's this place that's a fair place for girls. And you would understand too that there's a safety consideration in collision sports, which is why, for instance, the International Rugby, World Rugby Association has said trans girls cannot be on rugby teams, girls rugby teams, but they are now looking at developing trans girls, trans girl rugby teams that would not be at the club level, but might be at the province or the district level. In the same way as we deal with handicap sports. If I only have 2 or 3 kids in wheelchairs, right? Instead of having a wheelchair basketball team at my school, I have a district world wheelchair basketball team to play against other school districts. So there are solutions here, but they require people who are committed to including trans girls fairly to sit down and figure it out. And that's what's not happening right now. Too much yelling and not listening going on.
I find it very interesting that generally the people who are against trans women playing in sports weren't truly the supporters of Title IX.
Well, yes, I don't think there's any question that there's transphobia at play behind these state laws that simply want to say, I'm sorry, you've got to play sport according to your birth sex, and who do not want to recognize gender identity at all. They don't want to bother. And if social justice is important, if it's just as important to recognize biological sex and your gender identity, then we've got to make sure that both can be accommodated under the women's sports umbrella.
Are you still working to get this compromise?
Oh, absolutely. And, one of the reasons the Women's Sports Policy Group got together is we're all a little older. We're all kind of former athletes. And we're not in the position of current athletes where people threaten their sponsors. And, they engage in this toxic warfare. And so current athletes are afraid to speak out because they don't want to deal with this. The young girls in Connecticut who brought a lawsuit, they were really chastised in social media, death threats, the whole business, we can't be in that place and come out with a good decision. So we've got our work cut out for us.
So are
Okay.
you looking forward to seeing what happens with the situation with the Olympics?
Yes, I think, Saunders is a great athlete, weightlifter, a trans girl that appears to have legacy advantage. And she probably has her testosterone down into the female range. But there's an example of a 35-year-old who, lived a life with this testosterone advantage and still has the strength and the muscle mass that gives her an advantage over other girls. We think that is at play here. So I suspect that if trans girls are successful anywhere in the Olympic Games, that that's going to precipitate public education and say, why is this? It's going to force all of the international sport federations to really pay attention to science and to come up with the right rule for their sport. Right now, people are avoiding making rules because they're afraid of the reaction, a social justice reaction of the trans community. And I'm hopeful that the Olympic Games provides the impetus for the international sport federations to do their scientific homework and to set fair standards by sport, by event.